Hello again, my wolf pack. It's been quite a while. I am so sorry I haven't been online. I have been very, very busy with moving from an apartment back down south, but also having to settle in, having to deal with a lot of things, just a lot of things in my life going on. So glad I finally got it all squared away for the moment. So I am back to do well, to tell the story in my own way of Alive, the Miracle of the Andes plane crash. Where we left off last time, I believe, was the remaining survivors have found the tail of the plane, the tail end of the plane, and four of the boys have gone there to try and hook up the batteries. To hook the radio up to the batteries. So you've got Robert Canessa, Nando Parado, Antonio Vizintin, and Roy Harley, who is their radio expert because he helped build a sound system with his cousins or something. And Nando and Roy and Antonio are very pessimistic about getting it working, but Roberto is extremely hopeful about it, and they spend several days trying to get it to work. Nando starts to get impatient, and so he and Antonio head back down to the fuselage because they're starting to run low on meat. And when they get there, they find that most of the people down there are very weak themselves. So Antonio and Nando dig up a body and bring some meat back to the tail end of the plane, where they Roberto and Harley have not had much luck. Like, there are thousands or at least hundreds of connections they can make to the different wires, and they never really figure it out. They managed to get the radio to play stuff that's coming from outside the mountains, like music, some news stories, and surprisingly, news that the search for them has been resumed, that a special aircraft is being used to take photographs of the mountains to try and find them again. And Roberto is ecstatic to hear this. He's like, can you believe it? They've started the search again. But Nando is way more pessimistic. And so he tells Roberto that he's going to go back to the fuselage and start to help make what is going to be a sleeping bag from material that Antonio found in the tail end of the plane. It's insulation that was used to go around the body of the plane. And if they take enough pieces and they sew them together, they can make a sleeping bag out of it. So Nando and the others head back down to the fuselage after Roy takes out his frustration by destroying the radio, taking it to pieces. And they run into a blizzard, basically. And Roy keeps telling them to leave him. He just collapses. He's like, just leave me. I'm going to die here. Just keep going. And Roberto and Antonio go ahead of them. And Nando is pleading with Roy. He's cursing at him, telling him to move, that he's a sissy. But Roy says, yes, I'm a sissy. Just leave me. And Nando starts to leave. And he has two different reactions, at least in his memory, although it all ends up in the same way. He just starts cursing, and he heads back and he starts beating on Roy and kicking him and swearing at him in the worst way and getting him to move. And by the end of their trek to the fuselage, where they do make it, Roy is basically being carried by Nando. But by the time they get there, they also learn that one of their fellows, Rafael Echevarren, has also passed away from gangrene of his leg. He has finally died. The brave man, they called him the Basque. He was always so brave. He never gave up. He always kept saying, I am Rafael Echevarren and I will return. He was so confident he would make it. And this brings down a lot of their spirits. So, over the next, several days, they Carlitos takes over the management of sewing up the sleeping bag. He starts showing others how to do it, and they use sewing thread and copper wire that they find to make this bag that will fit 3 people. But even though it's getting close to finishing it, Roberto starts saying that they need to rest. He needs to look after the injured. He needs to rest and build up his strength. Whereas Nando's ready to go. He wants to just go. And now the Strauss cousins are starting to get very, very impatient and annoyed with Roberto, because it's like he went through all this stuff. They've gone through all this. And for Roberto to suddenly, delay them again and again and again, partly because he says the weather's not good, because he says he needs to rest, the sleeping bag's not ready. They start pushing him, and Nando starts to push him even more, saying, if you don't come with me, I'm going to go without you. And he keeps delaying until, unfortunately, December 11th. What's been happening for a while now, for several weeks, is that Numa Turcate, after being forced out of the expedition, has just given up. Like, he still has hope for his friends, but he has stopped eating because he just couldn't stomach human flesh anyway, and so what little he was eating, he just gave up, and whenever they tried to force him, he would hide it. And he just got lazier and lazier and lazier. And the more lazy he got, the less he ate. And the less he ate, the weaker he got. Until finally, he was nothing but skin and bones. Quite literally. And by the time of December 11th, he's dying. He's in a coma. And his friend Pancho Delgado tries to help him. Tries to take care of him, but Numa, who had given so much for the group, wouldn't fight for himself and gave all he had. And on December 11th, he finally passes away, which is a huge, huge, huge blow to the group, because he had always been kind, he had always worked hard, he had always done what he could for the group when he had the strength. And so Nando goes to Roberto that day, all of them shaken by the loss of Numa. And he says, I'm leaving tomorrow with or without you. And Roberto says, I'm coming with you. So December 12th, Roberto, Antonio, and Nando take the sleeping bag, several other supplies, their snowshoes made out of cushions, and a 10-day supply of meat. And they tell everybody that they're going to head east. They're going to head west. They're going to go over the mountain. They say a prayer. And they start heading out. And then Nando turns around, comes back, and he tells Carlitos, listen, I don't know if this is going to succeed. We're going to do our best. But if the time should come, and the only bodies left are my mother and sister, you have my permission to use their bodies. And Carlitos is stunned by this. It's like, oh my God, he's giving us the ultimate sacrifice. The one thing that Nando could safely say is his on the mountain and that he can protect are the bodies of his mom and his sister. And he's saying, use them if you need to. And this just strikes a chord in the group. And then Nando turns around, heads out. And Nando, Roberto, and Antonio had thought that it would take them, they would use one day to climb all the way to the top of the mountain. It takes them 3 days to get to the top of the mountain. They have never experienced rock climbing, let alone climbing a mountain that is 45-degree angle steep. So they every few steps they have to stop for a few minutes, take a breath, then start over and keep going. There's loose rocks that nearly kill them at one point. Although during those 3 days, they do find that the sleeping bag does work. So they can survive in the cold using the sleeping bag. on the morning on the evening of the second day, Roberto says that he can see a road from the mountain, but it's heading east. And Nando doesn't have good eyesight, and he doesn't have his glasses, so he's like, I don't see a road. And Antonio's like, it could be a road, but it could also just be a natural thing. I don't know. But Roberto's by the third morning, he's like, if we need to take that road. And Nando says, listen, I'm going to the top of the mountain. Don't make your decision till after I get there. And Roberto, he's still wavering, but he says he'll wait. Nando gets to the top of the mountain before Antonio, and he gets there. And he is stunned by what he sees, because all around him, for miles and miles and miles, all he sees is mountains. Mountains, mountains, mountains. And he says, in that moment, I knew I was dead. But I decided that if I was going to die, I was going to die walking. So he calls down to Antonio, tells him to get Roberto, that it's a great sight. And Roberto climbs up in a few hours. And when he sees what Nando sees, he is utterly destroyed. He's like, this is impossible. We've had it. There's no way out of this place. But Nando says, you see those two mountain peaks right there? They've got no snow on them. That's the way out. And Roberto says, those must be 50 miles away. We'll never make it. But Nando says, listen, we can make it. We'll send Antonio back down the mountain by himself, and we'll take his extra food, and you and I will head out. So what do you say? And Roberto thinks on it and says, you know what? I'm with you. We've survived together. We're friends. Now let's go die together. So they take Antonio's food and they send him back down the mountain, which actually only takes him about 45 minutes to get down, which took them 3 days. But Nando and Roberto start walking, heading down the mountain. When Antonio gets back, he tells them exactly what happened, that Nando and Roberto decide to keep going on their own to save up food. And he also tells them about the road that Roberto says was heading east. But they all kind of dismiss this, like, no, the Chile's to the west. That's the only thing they can go on, is that Chile is to the west. And Antonio, on the advice of Roberto, starts gathering up all the lungs. The lungs. Because Roberto said that those can be eaten, and that there's nothing wrong with that. But they're also still rationing very severely. So Roberto and Nando keep walking and walking and walking for days. At one point, on the 7th or 8th day, they see a point in the ground where there's running water, like a river, and that the ice stops and the stones and grass start. And Roberto says, between those lines, that was the step between life and death. So they make it down these mountains, and they get into the lower regions, and unfortunately now there's a new problem. Without the cold, sub-zero temperature to keep their meat cold, it starts to go rotten. So now they're going to run out of food a lot sooner. But they do start finding signs of human civilization, like they find a rusty can. They find animal dung. And they see a cow. On the 9th day, or the 10th day, I apologize, Nando and Roberto camp out, thinking that if they can kill one of the cows that they see to feed themselves. But they're very weak. Very weak. Roberto's got diarrhea, and most of his strength is gone. And then Roberto yells to Nando, Nando, a man on a horse. And across the river, they see a man on a horse. And they start waving to him and trying to signal him that they need help. But the only word that they can hear over the huge river from this man, when he's just staring at them, he yells to them, mañana, tomorrow. And so Roberto and Nando go to bed, go to sleep, thinking maybe, just maybe, we're rescued. The next morning, there are 3 men at a campfire across the river, and they can't hear each other yelling over the river. So one of them takes a rock, ties a paper and pen around it, and throws it across the river to Nando, who quickly writes a note that has become famous throughout the entire story, where he's basically asking, can you come help us? There are injured people up in the mountains. We need help. We fell from a plane. Please help us. Where are we? We're starving. And Nando throws it back to him across the river. The man says, wait there. And this man, Sergio Catalan, rides 10 hours on horseback to get help at the nearest civilization. Along the way, he sends other people to help on horseback, but he's basically just on his own for 10 hours just to get help. And Nando and Roberto are grabbed by a man on a mule who shows them a footbridge nearby, and they cross over, and they're brought to a peasant hut where they gorge themselves on food that is in the hut. Cheeses, soup, I think some kind of macaroni. Forgive me if I don't do that one right. And beans. And tortillas. And the next day, when Sergio Catalan arrives again, he's accompanied by the army and a huge number of reporters who have gotten there ahead of him to get in on this story, which Roberto and Nando share a good amount of information, though they do leave out the names of the survivors because they say we don't know if anybody else has died or not, and what they ate. Instead, they give a small lie of saying we ate cheeses and herbs that we stocked up on before we left Mendoza. Otherwise, they don't mention it. And so the army asks where they are on the map. Nando points it out, and they say, there's no way, not a chance. That's Argentina. There's no way you could have walked there. You're mistaken. And Nando says, listen, I don't know if that's Argentina or not, but that's where our friends are. And so they're like, listen, we're not going to be able to find it without one of you coming with us. So Nando somehow finds himself strapped into the helicopters. There's 2 or 3, and showing them the way. And the whole way they're like, are you sure you know where you're going? Are you sure? Are you sure? And he's like, yes, yes, yes. And then they get to where he knows on the other side of the mountain his friends are. But it's so high up that the helicopters are shaking and vibrating violently. They can't get over this mountain. And so the helicopter pilot says, listen, at this point, we can only volunteer to do this. This is a very dangerous mission. We're going to go around and find a pass, but I need everybody to sign off on this. Everybody says, let's do it. And so they go around the mountain. Nando's temporarily disorientated because he doesn't exactly remember the moment. And then he says, down there, I see it. And they have to get within a handful of yards just to see the plane. And it's taking all the control of the pilot and all their skill just to hold the helicopters in a hovering mode. And he says, we're not going to stay here. We can't land. They try throwing a smoke grenade out so they can see where the wind is going, but it just spins around everywhere. So a few of the Andes, the rescue corps, jump out. About 4 men jump out with bags and food and supplies, while a bunch of the survivors start jumping into the helicopters. Like, it takes seconds. It's happening in seconds. And that's when they take off again. Going back a little bit, the day that Nando and Roberto were rescued or found, Carlitos, Daniel Fernandez, and Fito Strauss all had premonitions that Nando had been found. Nando and Roberto had made it, but they didn't say anything except to each other. And then they go turn on the radio, and that morning they hear that 2 survivors have walked out of the mountains. But they say, don't say anything to anybody yet. We need to wait and see. And by the mid-afternoon, the news is all over the radio. Every channel is saying 2 survivors by the name of Fernando Parrado and Roberto Canessa have been found, and that there are other survivors. And they all start cheering and thinking that they're completely saved. That they they start getting themselves ready by combing their hair, putting this kind of a pomade or grease in it. That was the only thing that they didn't try to eat because it was just horrible. And they start celebrating in a way. And they also ask, what should we do about the bodies? Should we bury them? And they're like, there's no way we can bury them. It's too frozen. It's too hard. And why should we? That we have nothing to be ashamed of. So they were ready when the helicopters came. They had started packing up belongings and mementos they wanted to take with them. So the first group of survivors, 6 of them, and then also Nando, head back to Los Maintenance, which is where they had been, Nando and Roberto had been found. And the helicopter commander says, listen, we can't go back tonight. It's way too dangerous. We're going to have to wait till morning. So the other 8 survivors are left on the mountain with the 4 Andes, who do the best to take care of the survivors, giving them some food, offering them comfort, basically. They also start taking pictures, which the survivors are like, listen, what are you doing? And they're like, no, listen, this is only for the record of the Chilean Air Force. No one else will see these. So it's hard to stay angry with their rescuers. But that night, the Andes set up a tent outside because there's a bit of a smell from the airplane, which the survivors are only just catching on to. But they refuse to let them go to sleep without having at least one of the Andes join them. And he stays up that night with them, telling them that the world will understand what happened, and they share their story. And by morning, they're all demanding that they get fed, that they get their breakfast. By mid-afternoon, they've been taken from the fuselage and brought back to Chile, where they are reunited with the others. And over the radio, the families are slowly hearing about their loved ones, or at least about the survivors. And Carlos Paez Velario, Carlitos' father, who's still been searching for his son, he gets the list. And he's given the opportunity to read the list. He's to say the name of each survivor twice to let everybody know. And he goes down the list slowly, until he reaches his son. Carlitos Paez, mijo, my son. And he lists off the 16 names of the survivors. So the list of the survivors is Nando Parrado, Roberto Canessa, Adolfo Strauss, Eduardo Strauss, Antonio Vicentin, Daniel Fernandez, Alvaro Mangino, Carlos Paez, Pedro Algorta, Bobby Francois, Jose Inciarte, Javier Metal, Mancho Sabella, Gustavo Zerbino, Roy Harley, and Pancho Delgado. 16 of the original 45 crew and passengers are survivors. They are taken to the hospital in Chile, Santiago, Chile, where they are... Roy actually is taken to a separate hospital where he nearly dies. For the next 8 to 10 days, he's on the verge of death, like hovering in between. And the doctors work day and night to keep him alive. And thankfully, he does survive. But Every one of the survivors has lost a lot of weight. They're malnourished. They are in pretty bad shape. And one of the doctors, Dr. Alcine, starts asking he asks a pretty normal question to Inciarte, asking what was the last thing you ate. Inciarte replies, human flesh. Alcine keeps working on his leg, cleaning it. No word, just continued working. But he immediately sent word to his staff that no reporters to be allowed in. And he also sends word to a friend of his, a local priest who comes to the hospital. Father Rojas, Andre Rojas, who he arrives at the hospital and he starts talking with them. And the first person he talks to is Coches. And he quickly learns that through Coches' very spiritual way of talking, that they had to eat the bodies of the dead. And he immediately confirms with them that, listen, none of you did anything wrong. The sin that you have committed doesn't exist. If you had committed any sin, it would have been to let yourselves die. To eat the dead was the right thing to do to stay alive. And he refuses to hear their confessions because he says there's nothing to confess. And so, for the next few days, the families start arriving. And actually, before they do, the patients are very unhappy that the doctors aren't giving them more food because they're being given IV drips and some gelatin. And they're all demanding that they be fed. And this is the first sign that these aren't regular patients because they just refuse to listen to the nurses. They are like, they sign a petition saying that the doctors are starving them. And so the doctors give in and tell the nurses, give them full meals. And that's exactly what they do. They just start eating a lot. Some of them suffer some pretty bad consequences, at least in terms of dietary things, like Javier. At one point, they are given a huge cake and some chocolate mousse, and Javier spends the night on the toilet because he can't stop. He's suffering the consequences of the mousse. And one of the survivors drank a full bottle of Coke, which just made his stomach swell up. But they're all just eating and eating and eating. And then their families start arriving bit by bit. Nando's older sister literally pushes her way into the hospital to talk to Nando, along with her husband and his father, who, through a false report, had heard that all three of his family were alive, which he learns that only Nando survived. But they quickly discuss what happened. Nando is just so happy to see his family. He's basically being their rock instead. And he tells them that they had to eat the dead, and his father's like, you did what you had to do. Other survivors' families, they hear the news, like Roberto's mother and his girlfriend. When he tells them the news, what he had to do, they don't care. They're just so happy to have him back. But his father, who's a doctor, he actually can't hide the disgust on his face and the shock. And so a lot of the other survivors see that on their families' faces, which they read as, should we have died instead so they didn't have to hear this? And even though they were kind of ready to see that, they were also just so emotionally vulnerable. But the day after Christmas, with the miracle of the Andes all through the papers, all over the radio, the Andean Rescue Corps released the pictures that they took at the fuselage of the dead, cut up bodies, to the newspapers. And the world goes insane. The newspapers go insane. The reporters go absolutely bonkers, trying to get interviews with the survivors, trying to ask them if this is true or not. And the survivors, they try not to say anything until they can get at least some of themselves back to Montevideo to have a joint press conference. But there's a lot of things in the newspaper asking about it, and one newspaper goes so far as to say that the avalanche never happened and that it was a lie to cover up the fact that they killed the weaker to eat them. But when they get back to Montevideo, at least the majority of them, they do hold a press conference. They are welcomed back as heroes by their fellow countrymen. Which, oddly enough, in Uruguay, the newspapers did not print anything. They did not ask questions about what happened until the joint press conference. And Cochise was supposed to give the speech on what they had eaten, because each survivor was going to cover a different thing. And they asked Cochise to do it because he was so well-spoken on the spiritual level of it. But he got nerves, and he asked Pancho Delgado to do it, who, thanks to his eloquent, lawyerly way of speaking, he was able to start talking about it. And he said this was a very intimate thing for us to do, because we thought to ourselves, if Jesus had given his body, his spiritual body, to his people, saying, use my body for spiritual life, then he was telling us to take physical life from the bodies of our friends. And by the end of the press conference, there was complete silence. And when it was asked if there were any more questions, everyone said no. And there was huge applause for the survivors. So, 16 survivors of the Andes plane crash. I will get into a little bit of their afterlife, their life after this crash, in my next video, which I hope will be a lot shorter. So thanks for listening, guys, and glad to be back. Charlie Black, out.